several things we have learned so far, and we will trying to understand the definition and the scope and the several schools of comparative literature. Uh, I have already sent this to your email address. Okay, so you can see and read. Okay, so you see that comparative literature. So what is comparative literature? If we want to define comparative literature, we will be defining it in such a way that comparative literature is a comparison, and it is an academic field that compares literature and culture across linguistics, national, geographic, and disciplinary boundaries. So it is the definition of comparative literature. And naturally, we know that the literature of two languages, the culture of two languages, two authors of two different languages, two author of two authors of uh, one language can also be compared in this academic field. And the characteristically intercultural and transnational field of comparative literature concern itself with the relation between literature and broadly defined that other spheres of human activity, including history, politics, philosophy, art, and science. So comparative literature will only be comparing literature of two authors or two languages, not like that. However, comparative literature can also compare literature with history, literature with politics, literature with philosophy, art, and sciences. That is comparative literature. And the students and the instructor or the researcher who will be dealing with comparative literature, they are usually called comparatists and have traditionally been proficient in several languages. And naturally, what we have understood that when a person is going to compare something, literature or language, he or she has to be proficient of several languages and acquainted with the literary tradition and the literary criticism, and uh, and also the major literary text of the languages the researcher is supposed to compare. Okay, that means he should, he or she should have some knowledge regarding uh, languages, more than one languages, cultures, and other context. However, nowadays, many other subfields are included with literary comparative literature. That is critical theory, literary theory, and stretching theoretical acumen and the ability to consider different types of art concurrent, uh, concurrently, of her proficiency in multiple languages. So, comparative literature is interdisciplinary, and the interdisciplinary nature of the field means that comparatists typically exhibit acquaintance with sociology, history, anthropology, translation studies, critical theory, cultural studies, religious studies, gender studies, and so on. So, the literature, comparative literature, nowadays is dealing with some other subfield like translation studies, cultural theory, cultural studies, and so on, and also the religious studies. And the term comparative literature and the world literature are often used to design a similar course of study and scholarship. So another word, world literature, comes in our mind. Another literature, another thing, that is the national literature. What is national literature? What is uh, world literature? So we will be dealing what is a general literature. Okay, naturally we will be dealing those definition in this class. And comparative literature is more widely used term in the United States, with many universities having comparative literature departments or comparative literature programs. And if we consider the early history of comparative literature, who first coined the term comparative literature? In this regard, we have learned many names. Okay, so as you see, the highlighted names: John Andreas, Hugo Maltese, uh, Procentes, and also Goethe, also Alexander Velenovsky, Victor Chimarsky. So these are the personalities who claimed or who had been doing something that can next time be termed as comparative literature. However, the word world literature is coined by Goethe, the in his version, that is the world literature. As you see, this is the exact um, pronunciation, that is wealth, wealth literature. Okay. And comparative literature, that word was first mentioned by Andrew Matthew Arnold, okay, in one of his essays. So these are the term comparative literature. And whenever we will be dealing with the development of comparative literature, several schools comes in our mind. And the first school of comparative literature, they had been doing the activities that can be um, very much and in and one way uh, that in a one way that can be claimed the comparative literature initial stage, that is the French school. And this French school, from the early part of the 20th century until Second World War, the field was characterized by notably empiricist and positivist approach, termed as French school, and in which scholars like Paul van Degenham examined work forensically, looking for evidence of origins and influence. So the first school of comparative literature that can be termed at French school, and the French school has initiated the two ideas. They, the comparatist of French school, had been dealing with the two points, especially, that is origins and one influences. Origins, that means what is the origin? That means the historical pinpoint of a literature, the history related to literature, that is the root of a literature, and how does a literature influence other, and how does a literature being influenced by others. So these 2 points is the very vital in case of the French school of comparative literature. So thus a school might attempt to trace how a particular literature or idea or motive traveled between nations over time. And when a literature travels uh, from one nation to another nation, what is the origin and how they influence other literature. In the French school of comparative literature, the study of influences and mentalities dominates. So these are the two basic important fields of French school, school of comparative literature. Today, the French school practices the nation-state approach of the discipline, though it also promotes the approaches of European comparative literature. So far as we know that the French school is the initial school or of comparative literature, and next time we will see that some other literature in this European continent, they had been following such technique. That means the origins and the influences. When we had been taking classes in the initial stages of this course, we had elaborate discussion about that. That is the origin, how, and the influences. So next time, the European comparative literature is more or less synonymous to these 2 points, origins and influences. And such kind of European comparative literature, the publications from school includes, that is, Literature Compare, 1967, and the La Critique Literature, 1969, and La Literature Compare, 1989, and translated into English as a comparative literature today, methods and perspectives, 1995. So the first school of comparative literature, that was the French school, they initiated two basic terms of comparison. That is, they had been investigating the origin of literature, they had been investigating the roots of literature, and they had also been investigating the influence. How does a literature influence other literature, and how one literature is being influenced by others. So that are the basic points of comparative school of French school of comparative literature. And next time, that became a basic tenet of European comparative school. Next school we have in our hand, that is the German school. As we have told it earlier, that is the German school includes the European school of comparative literature. Here something we see that German comparatists working in East Germany, however, were not invited or nor were recognized colleagues from the French or the Netherlands. And yet, while he was oriented towards the West and the new allies of the West Germany and paid the attention of the comparatists in East Europe, his conception of the transnational comparative literature was very much influenced by the East European literary theorists of the Russian and the Prague school of structuralism, and from which works Rene Wellek and the derived many of his concepts, a concept that continue to have profound implication for comparative literary theory today. So in German School of Comparative Literature, we see some important name like Jacques Derrida, Goldman, Paul Deman, and Solem, Theodore W. Adorno. So these are the Geoffrey Hartmann, Leon Trilling. So these are the important name of German literary school, or German school of comparative literature. And next school that we come, that is the important school of comparative literature, that is the American school of comparative literature. Reacting at actually, so as we have learned a bit about that French school, German school of comparative literature, next time French, next time Italian, next time the other Western or European literature, European schools of comparative literature, more or less tend to the structuralist theory, and also are very much intended to investigate the root and influence. So very much related to the nationalistic approach of literature. They want to put a boundary of comparative literature. Okay. Reacting such kind of notion uh, of French school, post-war scholar collectively termed as American school. So, sought to return the field of matters more directly concerned with literary criticism, de-emphasizing the detective work, detailed historical research, origin and influence, and that the French school had demanded. So the empirical school was more closely aligned with the original internationalist version of Goethe and the Prosnet, reflecting the post-war desire for international cooperation, looking for examples of universal human truths based on the literary archetypes and that appear throughout the literature from all times and places. So, American School of Comparative Literature established or started its journey from a reaction to French school. As I have said, that the French School of Comparative Literature were very much intended to nationalistic or stylistic approach, but American school of comparative literature was very much tended to universalism. They wanted to cover the boundary of national border, and uh, they uh, they are including the some other writers. Prior to the advent of the American school, the scope of comparative literature in the West was typically limited to the literature of Western Europe and Anglo-American, and predominantly literature in English, German, French literature. Italian literature, especially of Dante, and Spanish literature, so like that. And as a survey of the techniques of realism in text, whose origin spanned several continents and the 3,000 years. So these were the approach before American school. So when American school came into shape, then that approach, that structural approach of comparative literature, that nationalistic approach of comparative literature became a universal approach of comparative literature. So the approach of American school would be familiar to current practitioners of the cultural studies, and even claimed by some to be forerunner of the cultural studies boom in the universities during 1970s and 1980 decades. So through the comparative literature of American school, we see that several sub-genre or subfields came into shape, like cultural studies. And so a literature will not only be compared through the origin and influence, literature can also be compared based on the cultural basis, based on the context, based on the other thing related to the text and the author. The field today is highly diverse. For example, comparatists routinely study Chinese literature, Arabic literature, and the literature of the most other major world languages and regions, as well as English and continental European literature. So before American School of comparative literature was in the territory of Europe. But after American literature, it started comparing literature of all languages of this world, including Chinese and Arabic languages literatures. So this is the basic difference between comparative literature, French School of Comparative Literature and the American School of Comparative Literature. And nowadays, many other uh, writers, not from America, not from Europe, they have been doing some activities based on comparative literature. That is the uh, Alamgir Hashmi's The Commonwealth and the Comparative Literature, Gayatri Chakraborty's Vivak's The Death of a Discipline, and next time we see the names G.M. Quetchi, Marcy Condi, R. Lovelace, V.S. Naipal, Michael Ordendo, Ole Senka, Derek Walker, and the Sekou. These are the person the next time they had been working on comparative literature. So, so these are the development of comparative literature that we know. That is the world literature and the comparative literature. Comparative literature was claimed by Matthew Arnold in one of his essay. World literature was mentioned by uh, Goethe in his What Was the Literature. But however, we see the tendency that the French School of Comparative Literature developed, and they had been doing basically on origin and influence. And however, some other literature of Europe was included in this school, that is the French School of Comparative Literature, that is the German School of Comparative Literature, Italian and English literature as well. And towards the reaction of the French comparative school, we saw another school of comparative literature, that is the American School of Comparative Literature, and they had been doing the universalism of literature. So the American School of Comparative Literature was trying to get comparative literature out of the national boundary, uh, and tried the comparatist of American School of Comparative Literature. They tried to put literature in a broader sense, not in a nationalistic boundary. Okay, and next time in the current situation, we see some other writer of the continents and other areas of world literature, they had been doing activities based on comparative literature like G.M. Koerji and V.S. Naipaul and Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. So they, we see that the French school sets condition on both studied literary text on one hand, as well as on the relationship of influence between them on the other hand. So the studied condition both on literary text, then in the origin of the literary text and their influence. It also obsessed with the terminology and makes distinction between influence, reception, and borrowing and imitation. So, based on the French School of Comparative Literature, a theory was developed. That what is the theory? That theory is called reception. That means how a literature is taken or accepted or received by the other readers all over the world. So that theory is called reception. And also similar to such kind of theory, we see borrowing. That means how a literature can borrow, or how some issues of literature is being borrowed from other literature, and also imitation. So these are the basic term relating to French literary comparison. So a theory came in our hand, that is the reception theory. And comparatists of the French school also distinguished between direct and indirect influence, literary and non-literary influence, positive and negative influences. So all the conditions set by the French school has led disciplines of comparative literature to a dead end. So when comparative literature was put in such a way, that means the comparative literature was not developed fully in the hands of French School of Comparative Literature. So the study of the comparative literature according to the French school, literary school and genres, ideological echoes, image echoes, verbal echoes, human models and heroes. So these are the basic tenets of comparative school, French comparative school, French School of Comparative Literature. But in case of American comparative school, if we uh, elaborate it in such a way, that is, the American school came as a reaction against French school. And its aim was to depoliticize comparative literature by going beyond the political borders of literary texts. So American school, as I have said, as we have learned, that the American school came with the idea of universalism. They wanted to take our literature out of the geographical and the political borders, and that is their concern. So always French school tried to exhibit nationalism. However, American comparative school tried to exhibit universalism, and that can also be called interdisciplinary. So it has a mainly two fields of study. Compare American school, they do. It doesn't give importance to the link of causality, that is the root. So the writer or the literature, from which writer or from which boundary it is taken, or who, so the writer and the uh, history is not important in case of parallelism in American School of Comparative Literature. It gives no importance to influence. There is a possibility of dealing with literary text not being in contact of whatsoever kind, or but having similar context or realities. So it has no importance on such kind of issues. It influence exists between literary text. So what does a text says? So American parallelism. And the importance doesn't lie in the influence itself, but rather in the context, not influence but context. If the context doesn't allow the influence to be effective, influence will never take place in the first place. And in case of intertextuality, they said that it is the reference of a given text to another text. New texts are superposed on the old text. New texts are always read under the light of the old text, that is called hypertext, and also the hypotext. And literature is a continuous and an ongoing process of reworking and refreshing old text. So always the American School of Comparative Research say that literature will be a continuous process of reawakening or reworking or refreshing or rewriting, like that. Old text turn into some sort of raw materials used for the creation of a new one. So these are the idea of American School of Comparative Literature. So uh, we see some other write-up on the issues, that is the French. Here, reception studies, that is, uh, Van Tickenham was an indirect user of the theory of reception, as though he may not have been used the term reception. He focused on the process of communication. Chaparral, on the other hand, focuses mainly on the influence studies and its aspect like influence of X or influence of uh, knowledge of X on the neutral level. On the level of the emitter, he is concerned with the fortune, reputation, diffusion, radiation. Wherever on the level of the receptor, he focuses on reaction, critic, opinion, reading, and orientation. He also charts another category that deal with the reproduction of the text, its face, reflection, mirror, image, resonance, echo, and mutation. Thus, he charts out the different aspects one can explore in the area of influence of literature. So this is the reception theory, and another theory that is the thematology, as the word hints more at a methodology deriving from the concept from the psychoanalytic school and Bakhthin's stylistic criticism. Bakhtin studies intertextuality and thematic formal study of the carnavalence cue. Okay, so another theory relating to comparative literature, that is the thematology. Thematology will be comparing the theme or motifs of the two literature. However, such kind of approach in comparative literature is very much synonymous to Bakhtin's intertextuality. Uh, So here there is a comparison between the French and the American School of Comparative Literature, because these are the two prominent school of comparative literature. The French and the American school are quite similar as far as their groupings, diversity, and liberalization go. But there are minor differences, especially stemming from the lack of a truly comparative perspectives in the French school. The American school has a blend of wide range of things. So, French school, their scope was a bit narrow. That is the influence and origin and the history. But the American School of Comparative Literature a bit wider range, including the other area, that is the culture, that is the gender, that is the translation, that is the other fields are included in American School of Comparative Literature. So these are the extension. Okay, we have to learn about that. So we want to see some other. So here there are some quick questions, the quick look of some questions. So define comparative literature. So what you have to do after finishing the class, you have to write the definition of comparative literature. So you will be writing the definition of this text. That is, can you hear me, everyone?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
sir.
so you have to
Yes,
write
sir.
the definition of comparative literature, world literature, general literature. You have to write the definition, and you have to write a descriptive note on French School of Comparative Literature, American School of Comparative Literature, and the difference between American School of Comparative Literature and the French School of Comparative Literature. What is the difference between these two prominent school of comparative literature? So there are some quick question over here. Okay, so what we can see that I have read this question. Just uh, you can also look at the write-up. Okay, so what you have to do, you have to understand this definition and you have to write in your own words, not as you see on the screen. Okay, so if you define the comparative literature, we have understood that comparative literature is about comparison. Okay, so comparative literature is a study of literature beyond the confines of one of the particular country, and the study of the relationship between literature in the one hand and the other areas of knowledge. So comparative literature is the comparison of literature beyond boundaries, as well as comparison between literature and the other. It is comparison of one literature with another one. What is the scope of comparative literature? Scope of comparative literature: exceptional linguistics ability, theoretical knowledge, and how intellectual caliber are needed to do work on comparative literature. What are the basic tools of comparative literature? Gathering, shifting, interpreting evidence. So these are the basic tools. What is the aspects of comparative literature? Comparative literature envisages a comparative study of various literature with a view of understanding the elements of unity in diversity. That means unity in diversity, how diverse kind of literature can be united together. That will be dealing with in comparative literature. So comparative literature covers influence, analogy, thematology, genre studies, translation, literature and ideas, literature and the other arts. What are the major schools of comparative literature? As we have learned, American school and French school are the major uh, uh, schools of comparative literature. Who coined the word comparative literature? So comparative literature was coined by Victorian poet and the literary critic Matthew Arnold. As I have told you earlier, so this is what are to be compared while comparing literature and art. Okay, so these are the things that we will be dealing with the next time. Okay, that means when we will be comparing the literature of two kinds, then we will be dealing these six things. The following six things can be compared. Suppose when we will be comparing William Shakespeare The Tempest and uh, Amy Caesar's A Tempest, then we have to compare these things: theme, form, style, technique, genre, and time spirit. So these are the techniques we have to. So we will compare something thematically according to style and according to form, in which form this is written, and in which genre we have to write this. Explain Remak's definition of comparative literature. So this literature is given by Henry Remak. This definition is given by Bassett. That means Susan Bassett, whose book we had been following throughout this class. What is the national literature? National literature is literature within the four walls. The walls may be geographical, linguistics, or cultural. Okay, it needs a little bit elaboration. Suppose, just for an example, if we say that Bangla literature is Bengali literature is a national literature, the walls, that means the literature of the four walls. However, Bengali literature is also being produced by uh, West Bengal, Calcutta, but West Bengal, Calcutta is in India. So, if Bengali literature can Bengali literature be called national literature? So here, national literature is the walls of four walls, but the walls may be geographical. So when we will be telling about Bengali literature, that means Bangladesh is the geographical location, and the linguistics walls. That means that both the literature of West Bengal and the literature of Bangladesh both will be calling national literature, and also the cultural. If the people of Bangladesh share the culture with the culture of a country living of the people living in the Assam or Gujarat. So if they share the culture, then such kind of literature will also be calling the national literature. And the world literature, what is the term world literature was coined by Goethe, and it means a collection of literary pieces of all ages. World literature, as we know, that is the classics in world literature, and that places that have stood the test of time. Okay, that means through the process of the time, some literature gains prominence through the time, through the history, and through the nationality. So such kind of literature is called world literature. And it is an attempt to overcome the provincialism and the national prejudices. Okay? So I hope you have understood the world literature. That means the world literature, the classic literature that is still alive today. It was written maybe it may be written in 6th or 7th or 12th century. However, still if it is alive, and if it has the great influence towards the other literature or the nation, then such kind of literature is called world literature. But you may understood that world literature, the definition of world literature can be termed in 1 minute, but many students nowadays are doing their master's program in world literature. So world literature is a vast field. There are several pros and cons of world literature, but here in this comparative literature class, we will just understand the definition of world literature. What are the three types of comparison? National literature, comparative literature, world literature. And comparative literature in different countries. Comparative literature, it's in English. Literature compare, French. Literature comparada, Spanish. Literature comparata, Italian. So this is German. I can pronounce this. Uh, this is Japanese. Hika kau ban kaku, Japanese language. So this is the several words related to comparative literature. What is the binary study? The French school compared work of two authors of two nations. This kind of study is called binary study of comparative literature. Some name some of the French comparatists. So these are the names. Name some of the German comparatists. What are the principles can comparative literature adopt? Analogy, these are the principles. Reception, যেটা আমরা আলোচনা করেছি একটু আগে, reception and invitation, influence, movements or trends, and genre. What is the French contribution to comparative literature? The French comparatists introduced the influence study mainly in order to proclaim to the world that they were the first literary influence in Europe. So the French initiated the comparative literature. So in this regard, the credit goes to the French School of Comparative Literature. So they are the first. They influenced the literature in Europe. They wanted to mean so. French School of Comparative Literature. What is the American contribution to comparative literature? The Americans specialized in parallel studies. It is the Americans who widened the scope of comparative literature to include the psychological and the sociological approach. So, as we have told uh, again and again, we are telling again and again that American school includes psychological and the sociological aspects towards comparison. That is cultural studies, translation studies, gender studies. These are included sociology, music, art, context that will also be compared, and that is the contribution of American School of Comparative Literature. What is the role of comparative literature? So again and again, comparative literature enables one to understand culture from the inside with a study of international relation to different nations and the different cultures. So this is the elaboration of the definition. Okay, so I will also be giving this sheet to you to understand what is comparative literature and the others. So these are the elaboration. So what you will do, that you will not copy the words, you will read the text, you will understand it, and you will write a definition based on your own words. Okay, so again and again I am telling that you have to write the definition of comparative literature and the world literature and the definition of national literature like this, and you have to write the several two prominent school of comparative literature, that is uh, so you see some other fields. Okay, so this I will be giving you. So if you want to read this article, then you can also get some idea reading comparative literature. And
হ্যাঁ স্যার এগুলো দিয়ে দিবেন স্যার।
হ্যাঁ এগুলো দিয়ে দিব, এটা দেওয়া হয় নাই পরের এগুলো। এখন ঘটনা হচ্ছে যে